Well, we formed KCUR Studios to be sort of this separate little group that is designed to work closely with the rest of the organization, but operate really independently in terms of being entrepreneurial, innovative, fast-paced, and to be able to adjust really quickly to new opportunities. People's History of Kansas City is really the perfect product for us to launch out of KCUR Studios. What we did was we took something we were traditionally really good at, the long-form audio storytelling, and we are using a different platform to reach different audiences. But the best news about this podcast is it is reaching younger and more diverse audiences. And we've been very surprised at how quickly we've been able to build that audience over a pretty short amount of time.
I'm Suzanne Hogan. I helped create the podcast, The People's History of Kansas City. I'm also the host of that podcast. It's a product that KCUR Studios developed a few years ago because we saw a growing need to kind of dig deeper into community stories around us that, quite frankly, weren't getting the spotlight that they deserved. A lot of heroes, everyday heroes, renegades, and visionaries who have shaped our region, but a lot of people just don't know a lot about them, including myself.
Recently, I've been discovering some wild tales about local people and events, and they've been kind of blowing my mind. Stories of trailblazers, renegades, and workers who've made Kansas City what it is today. Women, people of color, immigrants, people who are sometimes left out of the official account.
A person lives as long as they are remembered.
This is my history.
You can't stop time.
If we don't tell the stories, who is? And if they're lost in history, they're lost.
People want to hear about what happened in the cities that they're living in, what made the city that they're living in right now the way it was. And so People's History of Kansas City is like the perfect way to continue giving that kind of content, continue to tell new stories that shape the city that we live in today. And we know that those are going to win for us. And then in addition, they have this really long shelf life. We can share them over and over again. And we've seen, based on real hard data that we've looked at, that we can share a story that we first produced 2 years ago, and it'll still get thousands and thousands of reads. A lot of industries, and especially in media, we looked back at what our coverage has looked like and seen that we have failed certain communities. We have failed communities of color. We have failed marginalized communities, and we have not included them in our daily news coverage. And I think we've seen efforts from different outlets to at least acknowledge that and correct some of that. But this, truly is like a concerted and ongoing effort that is baked into our mission, that is what we're going to continue to do, is to find these stories that we missed and to tell them, and then to share them again and again, and then to find more. Lifting up the voices of people who have been ignored by the media for years is not something that is a short-term series. It doesn't have an end date. And that's what we're trying to do with the People's History of Kansas City. And what it does so well is not tell that story in a vacuum, not tell it just as one incident that had a beginning, middle, and an end, but that continues to teach us lessons today.
So the story of Lyda Conley is really interesting. It gets into the deeper history of Kansas City, Kansas, and the dislocation of a lot of Native peoples to that region. And so that particular story is about this burial ground where a lot of Wyandotte people have been buried. And these three sisters, Lyda Conley being one of them, took it upon themselves to occupy that cemetery and make sure that developers didn't come in and basically desecrate the graves of their ancestors. And it's a really powerful, moving story about people fighting for what they believe in. And even Lyda Conley went on to try a case before the Supreme Court, making her the first Native American woman to do so.
She said, we're going to go to battle.
Judy Manthe is a member of the Wyandotte Nation of Kansas and is a cousin of Lyda's.
They shut the gates and padlocked them, hung a sign over the cemetery gates, trespassers beware, and they built a shack called Fort Conley.
Fort Conley was a 6-by-8-foot shack that the sisters built over their family's graves. They armed themselves with their dad's shotgun, and they lived in Fort Conley every day through cold winters, hot summers, protecting the cemetery grounds from trespassers.
That was the first episode we did of A People's History of Kansas City, and I feel like it kind of sets the scene for the types of stories we're trying to uncover. Like, that story exists, but no one had taken the time to really dive deep into it and give it the time that it deserves, quite frankly. And even in doing some of these really deep dive stories on certain characters, there's like this universal theme that I feel like exists in other places too. Our story about Henry Perry, who's behind Kansas City's iconic barbecue style.
The first episode I got to work on for the podcast was about Henry Perry, which is Kansas City's barbecue king. And he was around in the early 1900s, and he's kind of who created Kansas City barbecue in a lot of ways. But what was weird about it was that people didn't know who he was, and that included his granddaughter, who I found.
He just wasn't talked about. It was just known that he was the barbecue king, and that was pretty much it. It was not until I started to read and got older and saw other publications that I began to know that, oh, I think he really is someone.
One of those moments of realization came when Mackenzie found out that Henry Perry had been inducted into the American Royal Barbecue Hall of Fame.
Further researching Henry Perry alongside her and talking to her about what she was learning about her grandfather and what a big impact that was for her specifically, that was a huge moment because it made me realize that we're really in charge of making sure that these people's legacies are remembered. Since then, Bernetta Mackenzie, who's Henry Perry's granddaughter, actually received his Hall of Fame trophy, which she wasn't around for when he was actually inducted. So that was also really cool to kind of hear what it meant to her to get that trophy years after the induction ceremony when people didn't know she existed.
It's easy to think that a people's history of Kansas City would only be interesting to people who live in Kansas City or have lived in Kansas City, but what we're seeing over and over again is that like each of these stories is telling universal themes that exist all across the country. So, you know, in my job as news director, I constantly pitch stories from our newsroom to editors at NPR or at Here and Now or at Marketplace. And what I found is that my most successful pitches are the ones that are the people's history of Kansas City pitches. Those ones are the ones that people eat up, and they want to tell these stories, not just of unsung heroes anywhere in the world, but in this part of the country. This year, we was the first year we started entering people's history of Kansas City into all of our awards, and we've had such great success with that. We've collected a few regional Murrow Awards. We've collected honors from the Public Media Journalists Association. We've even, something that I never even dreamed of entering, earned a nod from the James Beard Awards, which is wild to me. We don't tell these stories for awards, but those nods kind of reassure us that the work that we're doing is noticeable. It's valuable.
And I think that there's a lot of people's history of Kansas City type stories really everywhere. So even though Kansas City's in the title, it's kind of more like a storytelling philosophy to just dig your heels in deep and get to expose different parts about your community that have maybe been there the whole time, but just needed a little bit of extra digging.
I think we have a lot of fun with our stories. They're not just talking about the histories of things, they're really giving people kind of their own narrative. We talk about what was happening around that time, and we really do bring it to life with sound and photos for the digital stories. And I think it's a way to kind of step back in time.
Back in the 1960s, if you wanted to know what was going on in Kansas City's gay scene, you picked up a copy of the Phoenix magazine.
It advertises bars, it advertises parties and events coming up. But then it also has some sort of hard-hitting, what's going on in the country is wrong, here's why you should fight back.
It's been a pretty good collection so far, I'd say. We've covered quite a range of stories, even the history of Kansas City's oldest black radio station, which is 103 Jams, which is a story we did recently. I got to interview members of the family, and they got to reminisce about their family history. We did a story about German dialects in Missouri and Kansas and how they're not being really passed down to the next generation. And it kind of was a nice snapshot into a moment where communities are trying to embrace their parts of their German heritage and their language, but that it's kind of the truth that if its language isn't passed down, then it fades away. And I think that's kind of an interesting metaphor for stories like this too. If you don't sit with someone and get the story, then it's literally in danger of fading away.
I think what's so cool about A People's History of Kansas City is that It's inherently unique because we do it in a very specific way, but the model is something that I think all cities could adapt and really should adapt to kind of explore their history in a deeper way. And history is confusing. You know, we're not always completely clear on a date. Sometimes you hear different things from different people, but what's important is kind of the through line and how it felt for those people and how it matters today. And I think every city would benefit from digging a little bit deeper into the people that created their city and made it what it is.
I think the KCUR Studios model is one that could be replicated a lot of places. What is different about it is that we've given this small group of folks the freedom to move more quickly and to try some things, and we actually encourage and want to fail at some things or to stop doing some things that aren't achieving our strategic goals. And if our strategic goals are to reach deeper into our community and tell the stories of our community to new audiences, then if we're accomplishing that, then we just go really hard at that with those products. And if we're not accomplishing that, then we need to be willing to walk away and step away or adapt and adjust. One of the neat things about this particular project is that we found a partner, a great partner in our community, a local library system, who shares some of our same mission and goals, but they also were able to provide some seed funding for us to develop this product and to get it out there. And then we've worked together to push the episodes out to broader audiences. So I think what's great about some of the new platforms is that there are additional, different, new, and unique opportunities to partner with community organizations, businesses, in order to provide the funding and the boost to really take the risk of launching new products.
So the team at KCUR Studios is a pretty small staff. It's pretty much me and Suzanne working on this podcast with help from a lot of other people, an editor, occasionally producers, but it's really a passion project for us in a lot of ways because we care so deeply about this mission. And to get more resources to be able to level up in that way would allow us to do so many more stories. And one of our favorite things to do is to kind of be in the moment and respond to what's happening in the news right now and find a historical thread that kind of sheds light on that. There's been a lot that's happened in the last few years between George Floyd and Roe v. Wade being overturned, and we've had episodes on those things and many others because we really do think that when something's happening in the moment, it's not just what's happening in the moment, it also is decades of context that kind of sheds a light on why it's happening now and what we should take away from it.
I've thought about this a lot, that I think a lot of different cities, if they looked in their own backyards a little bit more, could find a lot of people to highlight. Women, people of color, working poor. There's so many people who have shaped our communities who don't get street names named after them or don't get their moment in the spotlight as they should. And I think too often we don't recognize people even in the moment to take a minute to think about how much they've impacted the community that we all live in and benefit from every day.
I mean, isn't that what we're all looking for as human beings, is like a moment of joy, a story of someone succeeding, a story of someone, you know, going against the odds and then actually winning and making a difference. It's not just the need to learn more about the world that we're in, but it's the need to know that like we can take on the world, or someone can come from humble beginnings and against the odds, take on the boss or take on the man.
A People's History of Kansas City from KCUR 89.3. Subscribe now.